I would like to ask the Minister of Environment, Food and Agriculture when his department will undertake tests on air quality and publish the results in relation to air pollution.
On the Minister to reply, Mr Wood.
Thank you, Mr President. There are currently no requirements in Manx legislation to undertake air quality tests, and as such it is not proposed to carry out such testing in the near future. Previous testing has identified that there are some minor air quality issues, so that, for example, during rush hour, Quarterbridge has material levels of vehicle emissions on relatively still days. The issues identified are traffic related, and as the government has introduced a mitigation strategy to proactively drive down harmful emissions, this matter is being addressed in the longer term. While this is clearly not the same as dedicated air quality monitoring, the preventative aspect of the strategy, in combination with the actions to be delivered as part of it, should ensure that air quality improves over time, which I hope members will accept is more important.
Supplementary, Mr Peake.
Thank you, Mr President. It does state in the Public Health Act of 1990, Section 88, 1 and 2, that the Department shall make regulations. So we really would like to know, would the Minister undertake to this court to ensure that such regulations are in place? If you could answer that, please.
Minister.
The legislative situation is anomalous in that the relevant Act, Public Health Act 1990, specifies that regulations should be made to designate substances to be measured, but these regulations have never been introduced. The associated requirement to prepare a statement for timberwood every 3 years is dependent upon the designation. So horse and cart come to mind. At the moment, the substances aren't designated, so reports aren't prepared. But I would reassure members that air quality in the Isle of Man is somewhat superior to, if you take a good day in London, a really good day in London, that wouldn't even be an equivalent of a bad day in the Isle of Man. We live in a very clean atmosphere.
Supplementary, Mr Shimmins.
Thank you, Mr President. Is the Minister aware that Sustrans has developed a model which measures air quality benefits from both reducing motor emissions due to shifting to walking or cycling and the changes in personal exposure to air pollution as a result of traffic fumes? Would he be happy for his department to apply this model to our island to quantify the benefits that we can obtain?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. I am not aware of that, and if the member would like to talk to me outside of the court, I'd be happy to take that on board and see whether we can deal with it, and it may be a useful resource. But in terms of air pollution, there are very few issues on the Isle of Man, and we have to be aware that there are resource issues, and there are other important issues that may be more resource hungry than actually monitoring something that we believe is a bit insignificant.
Honourable Member for Council, Mr Henderson.
Guramayo, Ectoren. Would the Shafeshok acknowledge that, given that we have recently received our biosphere status for the island, that we're celebrating our island as a special place to live and work next year, and in support of my colleague in North Douglas, would he not acknowledge the importance, or the greater importance in that light, of actually monitoring air quality? And would he agree with me that regulation may well need to be looked at in special reference to vehicle emissions, of where we have the habit of motorists parking up and waiting and leaving their engines on, which could be in excess of half an hour to an hour in some instances, just in idle? And would he not agree that that will have quite an impact on our air quality?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. The situation with regard to the biosphere is not affected by the current vehicles' emissions. We have got biosphere status based on what we have at the moment. That doesn't mean we should rest on our laurels, and we should make improvements on a continuing basis, but we have a 5-year action plan associated with the strategy, which specifically includes emissions from vehicles. And as we all know, electric vehicles may become more common, and we will certainly be encouraging with more charging points over the next few years, and in fact events will probably overtake us, in as much that several countries have now said that by certain dates they're not going to be manufacturing any further vehicles that use diesel or petrol.
Supplementary, Mr. Peake.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank the Minister for his reference to comparing the Isle of Man with London. But the fact is that in 2008, the test did actually prove that we were actually higher than the EU recommendations. So the tests that actually carry out these tests are very inexpensive. They're just £15 for a diversion tube which actually tests nitrogen dioxide, which is the main cause from diesel cars. And the opportunity you have with your department is to give the public clear direction that our air quality is poor in certain areas, and you have the opportunity to give us some clear direction around that, so people can then make some informed decisions about the cars they buy in the future and how they can actually help improve the air quality we have here in the Isle of Man. And as my honourable friend, the Minister of Policy and Reform, said earlier, this government is a government of action. So I await the action from your department.
Cracking question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Action, that's what we're about.
On action.
The reality is, of course, that in 2008 there were some minor pollution issues identified. And education, and referring to Mr. Henderson's question about people leaving their cars running and matters like that, that's a matter of education, really, and trying to cajole people. But the reality is that there are minor issues with pollution, and I referred earlier to resources. What do we direct our resources at? We have a lot of problematic issues on the Isle of Man, and I'm quite happy to take on board the question of some monitoring, but I'm not going to commit to spend a lot of money on emissions monitoring on the island when I am informed by my officers that it is not a real problem.
Supplementary, Mr. Shimmins.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the Minister agree that perhaps it's difficult to be sure that it's not a real problem unless we're actually measuring the scale of the issue, and that also, turning to the question raised by my honourable friend from Council, Mr. Henderson, about vehicles being left running, that many parents are concerned about air pollution outside schools, particularly when many children are picked up in vehicles which are left running in the winter to keep the occupants of those vehicles warm.
Mr. Burt.
I'm not really sure where that's going, but in terms of is there a problem or isn't there a problem, some air monitoring, quality monitoring was carried out prior to 2008, but listening to the requests for further monitoring to ascertain whether there is a problem, I'm happy to take that on board, and we'll talk to the environmental health officers to see whether there is an economic method of monitoring air pollution that we can use and make those figures available, so that where there are areas that cause problems, maybe people can receive the education and address the issues.
Final supplementary, Mr. Peake.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'm glad to see that the Minister is moving towards some action, because I do, perhaps I can just jog us memory when we did serve in the department together, that there was a move towards working together with other parties on trying to get an inexpensive measuring system in place. And as I remind you again, it's just £15 for these tubes. If I can help in any way, Minister, please let me know.